And finally, explaining sensory and motor organization of the nervous system controlling human movement to a professor who teaches motor control.
When looking at the nervous systems of the body, we see that the nervous system is comprised of two separate systems, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is going to consist of the brain and spinal cord nerves, while the peripheral nervous system is going to be broken into two different parts, the somatic nervous system, which is involved in the movement of skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls all involuntary actions. Various regions of the brain are involved in receiving information and then creating movement based on that information. The brain receives sensory input and after interpreting that sensory information, then creates a motor output. Areas of the brain that are involved in sensory input are going to be the brainstem, which is important for relaying information between the peripheral nerves and the spinal cord to the upper parts of the brain. And also the parietal lobes, which is the part of the brain that receives and processes the sensory information that the body has received. For motor output, and involved in creating movement, are going to be the basal ganglia, which are involved in voluntary movement, and the cerebellum, which controls movement coordination. So after the brain receives information, that information is then translated into movement. The central nervous system is going to be heavily involved in creating movement. This nervous system receives sensory input and then produces motor responses via the nerves that are in the system. Motor or efferent neurons carry motor responses from the brain to the peripheral nervous system to help in the creation of movement. This system works to create movement when a direct demand has gone out from the brain to perform a certain movement. This information is carried down the central nervous system via efferent neurons. Eventually, this information reaches the peripheral nervous system and performs a number of synapses through interneurons to reach its destination. Once its destination has been reached, the reaction causes the limb to move. The peripheral nervous system contains both sensory and motor neurons, specifically the sensory or afferent neurons, which carry sensory impulses to the central nervous system, which are then relayed back to the brain as feedback. After movement has been initiated, the body will receive some input about the movement. This information will be relayed through the peripheral nervous system via the afferent neurons up to the central nervous system, which will then carry it to the brain to be perceived as feedback. After recognizing the systems that are involved in receiving information and creating movement in the body, we can then relate what we know about these systems to open loop and closed loop control. Looking at the open loop control, we see that these are going to be pre-structured commands from the body sent to effectors and that operate without the use of feedback. This is when the brain determines movement and commands that are sent to motor neurons, which then carry out the action. So we could think of this as when we have the central nervous system sending out a command to initiate movement. Looking then at closed loop control, we see that this is the system where sensory information is compared to the actual information about movement, and then that uses that information about errors and makes comparisons. In this system, the brain is going to use the perception that it receives to make a decision, and then it's going to create a motor response, which then the feedback from that motor response will be relayed back to the brain about movement accuracy. So to think about this and what we know about the systems involved in receiving information and creating movement in the body, we can think about our entire system of how sensation is translated into movement. When we receive a demand from the brain to be carried out through the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system to initiate movement. After that movement is initiated, we receive some type of feedback. And this feedback then travels back to the brain to relay to the brain what occurred in that movement. To summarize then, we can think of open loop control as a system that provides input and produces output without taking into consideration any of the feedback that is happening with the movement until after that movement has been completed. Whereas with the closed loop control system, it is going to provide an input, and while that process is continuing, it will be receiving feedback about the process to be able to make the appropriate adjustments to provide the correct